the x-ray showed the arm was broken. Well, it took a little while to get the cast off, and then I had to give instructions to the family. I said, now look, I don't have time to explain to you what I'm doing. Just do this and don't ask any questions. Well, he did. And 5 hours later, the boy was able to move his arm around with perfect freedom and no pain. He went down to the Greenfield Hospital. Was it Greenfield? Deerfield. One or the other. Went down to the hospital there in western Massachusetts and had an x-ray. And the x-ray showed that the bones were perfect in the arm where he had the break. There was no break there. But his thumb was still jammed, and they showed a slight injury and swelling to the thumb. We never worked on the thumb. All we did was worked on the area of the arm. Now, what happened? We worked on the area furthest from the head and where it hurt. And we had him re-experience moving his arm out and blocking a person in front of him with his arm, at which time it snapped. Now, he had all the memory up to the snap. He had all the memory after the snap, but he couldn't experience the snap. There was about a split second of time that he had no memory for. We kept working with that time until at the time that he experienced the severe burning, searing pain, which we call the Kundalini, the fire of the Kundalini. And when he experienced that, the bone structures snapped back into place, and we continued to experience that searing, burning pain as the bone structures healed. After which time, when the burning, searing left, there was no pain left in the arm, no matter where you pressed, no matter how you touched it, and he could get down and do push-ups when we were done. Now, the whole arm was healed. Now, he took the x-ray with him, went back to his coach in New York. That was on he broke it on a Friday. He came to see us he called me on a Saturday. He came up on a Sunday. He went back on Sunday. Monday, he was back playing football again. The coach saw that his arm was okay, saw the x-rays, and the boy just simply told the coach, well, I went up to see somebody who practiced some form of acupressure. And that's all there was to it. End of story there. So the broken arm was fixed. Now, in electric shock, one of the most barbaric treatments known to man is putting a person through electric shock. They call it therapy. It's a barbaric suppressive technique to where a person who is having some problems, just give them some electric shock, and it renders them just like a vegetable for a while. They can't think, they can't do anything, and so on. So with our work, we take them back through the electric shock that they have had, and they'll actually go through the shock right on the table while you're holding points, if they're nutritionally prepared. And they're just like a sine wave going right through the body. And their body's just bumping up and down faster than you can even move. And as a body's bumping up and down with that sine wave moving through it, just like you're shaking out a carpet at high speed. And it just moves very rapidly through the body until the person is able to overcome the effects of the sine wave, at which time their memory begins to return. They're able to get down to the thought patterns then which created a disharmonious condition to begin with in their mind, which would result in some sort of a, shall we say, emotional out-of-controlness, to where they come back to normal again. But electric shock should be put into the realms of barbarism. It should be put into the medieval times. It should be put into the same category as torture chambers, because it doesn't cure anything. It suppresses things below the level of consciousness that it takes quite a little bit of work to bring a person back to where you can work with them on a sane level. So I want to utter here, if you haven't really got the drift of my communication, a complete opposition to any form of shock wave therapy which would keep a person from uttering a sane breath. So that's a little heavy there, but that's the way it is. Many people across this land have been through shock therapy and are now being released from it. And hopefully we can put a stop to this through legitimate legislation and objection from the part of a humanitarian society. But we've taken a lot of people through electric shock and through this so-called shock therapy and other types of shock treatments. The next thing I'd like to talk to you about is, by the way, I forgot to mention, the sine wave is like in mathematics or in physics. You actually have what they call a sine wave, which I'm not going to get into here. But it's a sine wave like the waves on the ocean, or just like you put a rock in the lake, you see the ripples going out from it. That's a type of sine wave, and you see the body going through that at a high rate of speed. And it's impossible for a person to act that type of thing out. I like to talk again during the healing crisis we run across birth trauma. where a person goes through the lips look like a little baby who's just been born. The fingers look like the little cold fingers that were just born, you know. There might be a forceps delivery with all the traumas related to forceps delivery, with the pain in the head, the restructuring of the head, and so on. And you'll have, for example, even with where the forceps were on the forehead, you can even have red welts moving out there where they have where the forceps were coming in contact with the head. This, to me, stresses the importance of education of the woman and preparing her for childbirth so that you won't have the need for forceps delivery, so you won't have the problems with delivery because of natural childbirth training. And there are many different schools of childbirth training which can prepare a woman for a natural childbirth, so you don't have a surgeon hurriedly trying to get to his golf game on time, giving these large episiotomies so the child is born without going through the birth canal properly, without getting the head pressured, forcing the cerebral spinal fluid out through the rest of the body. Birth is a necessary process to prepare a child for life because the pressure on the head literally forces the cerebral spinal fluid out through the entire body, activating the body, getting the minerals to the body, so the child is ready for full motor coordination and activity. And where you don't have that natural childbirth, you have problems with the child in its developmental schedule. So birth is a necessary part of life, and we encourage it. Continuing with concepts of the healing crisis, I remember a little lady from West Virginia who had retired from her home ec teaching job, and I guess home ec and physical education, and she'd been retired for a number of years. And I remember when I was taken to her home, she couldn't hardly get around, and she could hardly move around. Her lips were blue. She had had 3 coronary heart attacks. She couldn't do any work around the house and was in very bad shape. Well, we held points on her. She had been preparing herself for several weeks on the nutrients, on the enzymes and minerals and so on. And in our first point holding session, all of a sudden, she turned purple, passed out, and quit breathing. At that time, the head of the house that we were in, where she had been brought over from the adjoining home, he left the house because he didn't want to be in the house when somebody died in his home. He got off and was just scared to death and left the house. Well, about 30 seconds later, she came to and described to us her first experience in the intensive care unit, where she had passed out and had all this pain, and how they had taken care of her with full memory. And then this went on for about 5 or 10 minutes, and the friend that had brought her over at this time became totally freaked out and left, and because she didn't understand the healing crisis, and we hadn't briefed her ahead of time, because we didn't know what was going to happen with the first point holding session. And a few minutes later, then she went into the second time that she went into the intensive care unit. She passed out this time for about 40 seconds and turned purple again and quit breathing. We continued holding points. The points continued to burn, and we continued to recognize that this was a healing crisis. Well, finally she came out of that and told us all about the second intensive care unit trip with her coronary heart attack. The third time she had tremendous pain, and she passed out again for another 30 seconds or so, and she went through a tremendous amount of pain and stress and whatnot, and re-experienced that. Now, after she came out of her third heart attack, all the lines in the sclera in the heart area disappeared, where the blotches were, and she had normal sclera lines. The amazing thing was that shortly after that, she took care of her house. She got her house in perfect order, where before she couldn't take care of it. She painted outside, she painted inside, she mowed the lawn, she took care of herself, and here she was in her mid-70s. And next thing I knew, she was taking trips all over the United States, and she had joined a senior citizens bowling league, and she was helping other people, and teaching them what she ought to be doing. I couldn't get her off her white sugar. She just loved to piece on her little candies and things, but my goodness, she loved it. So, if she wanted to do that, that was fine. You can't keep people from doing what she wanted to do. She was happy. She was traveling. She was doing things she's always wanted to do, and she couldn't do it because her heart was so bad. So what happened was, last time I saw her, she was absolutely in vibrant health, doing wonderful, feeling wonderful, and just going full tilt. And here she was, close to 80 now, last I heard of her, and she's still doing just wonderful. She takes just enough to keep herself feeling good while she's going full tilt. That's the way it is. But I thought I'd share that with you, is that she did go unconscious 3 times on the table in succession and went through her 3 times in the intensive care unit due to the coronary heart attack that she had. I'm reminded of another young man up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, who went at the Body Electronics Instructor Seminar that went through a calf muscle regeneration. And he went through tremendous burning, searing pain as his legs restructured. And these are genetic things. I remember over in Maui at the Visualization and Consciousness class, another man whose foot restructured, going through the burning, searing fire of the Kundalini as his foot literally restructured. And the same man before he was the first calf regeneration in the back of his leg where that I had ever seen. So I just want to share these things with you, is that during the healing crisis you sometimes have this severe burning, searing pain, usually with reconstruction of bone structures and muscle structures that needed to be corrected to the perfection that it needed. I remember in Montana, a man's arm was broken. It took an hour and a half the first time to fix it and get the bones back in place. But we didn't go through completion of the burning, searing pain. The next day he went out with his chainsaw and was cutting wood again, failed the same way, broke the arm in exactly the same place. At that time it took us an hour and 45 minutes to go through the burning, searing pain. And then his arm was perfectly fixed and he didn't have any trouble after that. I remember a lady in Salt Lake City who broke her pelvis. And we worked on her pelvis for a number of hours, and then all of a sudden it started to shift and moved around with a searing, burning pain. And after that, her whole body had went through a number of beautiful changes, and problems that she had had for years physically disappeared. And her body was literally regenerated with a very full change of consciousness. She helped write one of the most prominent herb books on the market today. I won't tell you what her name was. I remember a fellow with a broken neck. He came to me in a brace. He had broken his neck, and his neck was in terrible shape, and he couldn't move it with severe pain. The X-ray showed how there was fractures on the vertebrae. All we simply had him do was to relive him going over in his car 3 times, which he did with his head hitting the top of the car. And he did that, and he had this strange pop in his neck, and the pain disappeared, and the next X-ray showed a perfect neck. A man up in Modesto, California, who was a mailman, and he drove, his little mail truck around, and he had a wreck, and he went through a similar type thing. When I met him, we had to take the brace off and work on his neck, and his neck popped just like you'd take a carrot and break it, and popped, and the sound went all over the room. And I remember so clearly that his pain disappeared. And he went down and had an X-ray from another doctor, and his neck was perfect. He said, "Now, what do I do with this brace?" I says, "What am I going to do for insurance now? My neck's perfectly fine. I have no pain here. Everything's fine." He says, "Well, you go back to the doctor that put it on and have him examine it and let him take it off, and that'll take care of your insurance requirements," which he did. And he went back to work. So things like this are very, very important. A lady in Los Angeles, I remember, she sat through a seminar, and she had 2 huge bunions, one on each foot, right there, below the big toe. And during class, I was talking about dissolving calcifications. And so, unknowns to me, she told me the story later, she went over and started pushing on her bunion, and lovingly and willingly enduring the pain, and the bunion disappeared. And as she did that, she did until all the pain was gone, the bunion was perfectly gone. And the other bunion on the other foot was still there. And so she kept that second bunion to show the difference between the no bunion and the bunion that she still had as evidence of what could be done with the body electronics. So you have incomplete healing crisis as a conversational piece. So that was kind of interesting. I like to talk about nose jobs. We call it bone sculpturing. If you take a broken nose, like if a person has had impact with an immovable object, oak tree or something, going down a hill on a sled, which has been the case, where a person, while you're holding the nose in the area of the break, and get the burning and throbbing out, and get the person to go through the re-experience of the break that they had, and have them relive it exactly like it happened. They will feel the blood running down their mouth. They'll feel the choking on the blood. They'll feel the reconstruction of the nose, and they will remember when the nose assumed the flatness of the tree. And the whole nose will reconstruct right under your fingers, and the whole thing will straighten itself out. But remember, every single memory will come back in reverse order as to how it happened. I remember a German girl had her nose broken, and unbeknownst to me, after we worked on her spine and got her spine straightened out, unbeknownst to me, she was going in for a nose job the very next day. But I felt impressed to say, do you mind if I fix your nose while you're here? She had a very ugly nose, and it's all off to one side. And we worked on it and got that nose perfectly straightened out in about 5 minutes. And she looked at her nose, and she was so happy, and she said, I had been saving $2,000 for months to go in and get this nose corrective surgery on my nose. And she says, now I don't have to do that. And she gave me a great big hug and a squeeze, and was just doing real well after we fixed her nose. That's quite interesting. Golly, I remember a fellow who had been crushed between a truck and a freight car on a train in a very tremendous accident, and his back from one side to the other looked like a wedge. One side of his chest was all caved in to about 1/2 normal size, and the other side of his chest was normal. Well, we took him through a healing crisis on memory of getting squashed between the truck and the train. And his chest in front of everybody up there in Kelowna, British Columbia, it all straightened right out in front of all of us. And now he wondered what he was going to do because he'd been on welfare, or shall we say, what do you call it when you, slips my mind, workman's compensation, but in Canada it's a different term. It was a workman's compensation thing for being injured on the job, and he had been out of work all this time with pain in his chest. And I says, what do I do? He says, I can go back to work now, but I don't want to. He'd been enjoying being off the job and having that income coming in every month. So this is the type of thing you run into. A gal had, who many of you know, she's a trained instructor giving lectures in New York and Canada. This gal, I met her in Pennsylvania at the Elizabethtown College in what they call the E-Town experience. She had a broken collarbone, and I brought her up in front of the class, and I had her re-experience the broken collarbone. And the collarbone literally went back into place, and her eye color changed right there in front of the class that I had there at what they call Life Spectrums. It's a wonderful organization back east where they bring people in, and give seminars, every year. But this collarbone straightened completely out. Now, you might say that once a collarbone is broken and you have that huge calcification where it healed incorrectly, that you can do nothing for it. When you have the kundalini, or the fire of the kundalini, which is a burning, searing pain, happen to you, or you make it happen, so to speak, then that body will return to its pristine perfection, and the consciousness of the person will change with full memory as to what took place at that moment. And this is what happened to her. We handled another collarbone the same day with another lady, and she had 2 broken collarbones from a wreck she was in, and both of those were fixed by a couple of people who later on went ahead and took all the instructor seminars and ended up in Maui at the Visualization and Consciousness class. So that was kind of interesting. Kalamazoo, 2 men had arthritis, one for something like 20 years and one for something like 14 years. To make a long story short, when they released the trauma that they had suppressed and went through complete re-experiencing, the arthritic condition totally disappeared. There's a reconstruction in their bodies, and they both presented me with their canes right toward the end of the class of that week-long instructor seminar. I thought that was kind of interesting. One of the men, his eyes changed from brown to blue in one period of time in there in 24 hours. I said the iris color changed from brown to blue in 24 hours during that period of time. Another little lady, her eyes changed color also in Elizabethtown College there in Pennsylvania. And we had her, all we did was hold her pituitary gland on her toe, the reflex to the pituitary, and she went through a fire of the Kundalini release right there in front of the class there at the Life Spectrums E-Town experience. We had another man in Grand Lake, Colorado, in an instructor seminar in Denver area, and his eyes he was in his 70s, and his brown eyes went from brown to blue again in 24 hours. Kind of an interesting experience when you have all the suppressed trauma released, and you have a complete change of the physiology of the body and a complete change in consciousness. Now, suppressed anger results in arthritic conditions. And we have seen people. I remember one lady in Bismarck, North Dakota, was totally tied up with arthritis from a time that she had fear from falling into a whole mass of hibernating snakes that were coming out of hibernation. And it threw her into a spasm, where she ended up in the hospital in spasm and in a coma for a period of time. And when she came out of that, she was totally arthritic and she couldn't bend. And here she was, a ballet dancer. Now, she had that for 10 years. And so her husband brought her from South Dakota up to North Dakota in Bismarck, where I was at the time. And what happened was we simply held points on her, and she went into the screaming and moaning like you never heard. And she went right back into the spasm, and her back was arched up just like she was when she went into spasm when she fell into these snakes. And what happened is she re-experienced the whole thing. It took us a while to get her to even tolerate the fact that the snakes had a right to existence also, because she hated snakes with the venom. She had been out fishing with her husband, and she swam into the dock, and a water snake followed right beside her all the way into the dock. And she ran down along the dock to the land, and this water snake swam just right beside the dock all the way in toward the land. And she ran up on the land and then slipped and fell into near a hollow log where these snakes had just come out of hibernation, a whole mass of them. They're out there. She fell right in the middle of them, and that's when she went unconscious and went into spasm. And so we had to take her through all that memory. And when she got through all that memory, you wouldn't believe what happened. All of the arthritis in her body disappeared. And she could move her legs. And she could move her legs. Her facial structure, where it looked like just like skin stretched over a skeleton, all that disappeared. Her face was full. Her color was, instead of being gray-white, was red and rosy. Her whole body changed structure, and her whole facial structure changed. And she didn't have a solid joint in her body, and she could do some of her ballet steps again for us, which she did for us there in the whole group there in North Dakota. Very, very interesting. We could go on and on about all the different suppressed anger that people have had, where it has kept them literally from a normal life, because when you're in anger, this affects the thyroid and the parathyroid and builds up, shall we say, a locking of the joints and calcification of the joints that a person simply cannot move. I want to tell you a little story about a young boy that I met in Willowbrook, right outside of Chicago. This is one of the first times I came to Chicago. And I was on the West Coast doing most of my work up through California and into Hawaii and into Arizona and so on, and Montana and Utah. This little boy had muscular dystrophy. And the man sitting across from me, Orrin, will remember that the boy came in, and the father had tears in his eyes when he said, I've given up, or what was the exact wording he said? Let me go back and remember it. He said, I feared that my child would never be able to walk. And he was, when he got down, he couldn't get back up again. And he had muscular dystrophy diagnosed medically, and we went ahead and worked with him on his points. And in the motel there at Willowbrook, if I recall correctly, he ran all the way down the hallway and all the way back, and the exact words of his father said, I had despaired of my boy ever being able to walk again, much less run. And he's running back and forth at full tilt. All the nerve supply and all of the circulation was restored to his little body. And he went through a lot of numbness, and he went through a lot of emotional release during that time, and all of that trauma had blocked off the flow of cerebral spinal fluid. And when we got that going down through his body, that little body was restored to full normal activity. I could tell you many, many cases of MS. I remember up in Kelowna, British Columbia, we had a lady come over from Alberta in a wheelchair with MS. And after we gave her one treatment, after being on the program for about a month, we gave her one treatment, and all of her circulation and nerve supply was restored to her body, and she'd gone through a lot of trauma related to that, possibly in her trimester conditions, prenatal type memory, and went through an awful lot of trauma. And believe it or not, she was able to walk up and down stairs without any support after having been confined to a wheelchair for a number of months with MS. And I remember that because she could walk up and down stairs with perfect ease, with perfect feeling, and that recalls another thing I want to share with you. This happened in Mesa, Arizona. A lady there had MS for 18 years. And Dr. C. Samuel West, who's a wonderful friend who wrote this book, the Golden 7+1 on the lymphatic situation in the body. And this Golden 7+1 is a book you should all read. Her story is partially in there. But I remember Dr. West took me over to see her, telling me that she wanted to see me. And I told her, I told Dr. West, I said, I'm not going to go over there unless she wants me to come over. And she had told him that she wasn't going to ask me over, but if I wanted to come over, she'd be glad to talk to me. Well, he got the tables turned on both of us and told each one of us that we were invited over and that I was expected over and so on. And so I went over there, and she received me, and it was we found out it was much different than it was, because she had really was skeptically receiving me, and I was skeptically going over. Anyway, we finally got over there, and we started holding points on her. And she got all the feeling down to her body. And before, her legs were numb from the hips down. Now she could get up on a trampoline and bounce up and down and get herself going, but she was swinging numb legs. Now, what had happened? As Dr. West got her up on this trampoline, Dr. West, by the way, got her out of a bed where she was flat on her back in bed and couldn't move at all, and got her up to where now she was at least able to walk around by swinging her legs from her hips. And she was able to do a pretty good job of that. But once she got down, she couldn't get back up without crawling back up with great what I call it, stress, because she couldn't get back up on her own by herself. Well, what had happened is after one point holding, she had all of her feeling and circulation back to her body. And she said, this is the acid test. And in front of everybody in her living room, she got down and got back up on her feet by herself with no support. And she broke down and cried because she said, I have been praying for years that I could get down and get back up off my knees with my family in prayer. And tears came to everybody's eyes. We worked with a number of other MS cases there in Mesa. All of them part of that MS society, and the thing is the people who got well, they were obviously well. They could walk without the crutches. One guy, I remember, he went out and celebrated and had a ham dinner. And the next day he couldn't walk at all. It's showing what ham will do to a person. But before that, he was able to walk completely well without his crutches and walk down his trailer court, talking to everybody. He had no crutches, walking perfectly well. And so we needed to work with him some more, especially on his diet, which we didn't talk to him about. So from now on, I don't talk to anybody or work with anybody unless they're on a nutritional program. I remember another man who won who was the Disabled Man of the Year in the year 1977, and he had from the state of Tennessee. He had MS. He was one time the band director, and I remember them bringing him in up to Chicago. And the only thing that he could move was, if I recall, his left wrist, his right wrist, just a little bit, his right wrist, just barely move it, and he could move his tongue, but he couldn't move his head. He was flat on his back. He couldn't move anything but his right wrist and his tongue and his eyes. That's all he could move. He had lost his voice nearly, and he was being his job at the college where he couldn't perform his job and was being dismissed from his job and so on. So what had happened is we worked with him, got him on the program for 3 days. He passed his allotment of corn and fuzzies and was starting to clean from the inside out. His digestion was getting better, obviously, because of what he was passing. His diarrhea was very profound, and having to had 24-hour care and 24-hour attention, it was quite a scene to have uncontrollable diarrhea, especially with a person who's totally disabled. But he was able to move his arms off the table. He was able to move his head. I remember very distinctly. He could lift his head up for the first time and look at his watch on his left hand. And he turned his head, and he could turn his head back and forth and up and down, his arms up and down. And he went back to his full-time teaching job at Clarksville, Tennessee, and I forget the name of the college. But he went back to his full-time. He's there now for all I know. I haven't heard from him for quite a period of time. The big problem was getting consistent point holders. And this is one thing that all of you who are within my voice, you need to have a group, a support team of trained people who can hold points and who understand what's going on relative to the healing crisis. And that goes back to being able to educate people to know what's going on. I remembered one thing when I worked on him one time. I had my hand on a calcification on his spine, and all of a sudden I felt like I had my fingers literally plugged into an outlet, and I got the most severe shock out of anybody that I've ever gotten a shock out of. Now, since that time, electric shock has a great deal of effect upon the nervous system of the body, and I wonder how much effect that electric shock that is suppressed in the body has on the development of MS. I do know that with MS that we do need to have a test done on the mercury vapor which is escaping from the silver amalgam fillings in the mouth. And we have a machine which is available upon request where we can come into your area literally and test the amount of mercury vapor that is being emitted from your silver amalgam fillings to determine how much poisoning is actually going on, which we now know is a cause. Mercury poisoning is a cause for many symptoms, and one of the symptoms that has been positive, where there's a positive correlation between mercury vapor, or shall we say mercury poisoning, and MS. This is a positive correlation right there that we need definitely to look at. So we do have problems there. I can go on and on and on and tell you about the hundreds of people with diagnosed MS and MS symptoms that we can just go on and talk about it. Remember one gal from Northridge, California. She had MS and she came in with 2 canes, and boy, she could hardly swing her legs. Looked like a little wooden Indian because of the spasms in her muscle structures. After one point holding, which lasted about 10 hours, she was able to get up and walk, and she walked clear around the block for the first time with no support. And last I heard, she still had no support. The one thing that she told me, and I thought is very critical, she told me that she did not want to compete in society. And she did not want people to know that she was better, because she didn't want to have to compete in order to support herself and was depending on that monthly stipend that she had because of her MS. And I've run across this so much with people who are incapacitated. The incapacitation is often a physical external manifestation of internal thought processes, and we have to uncover the death wishes. We have to uncover the unwillingness to act or create or to move throughout society. We have to be willing to, the people have to be willing to look at their thought patterns where they are creating their situation in life. I came back just recently here from Indiana, and one girl down there had a neck which was terribly distorted. She had a terrible curvature of the spine, just in terrible shape. And so in just about an hour, she'd been on the program very heavily. Within 1 hour, we had the spine straightened out, and her spine was perfectly straight, and the curvature was completely gone. And then we began to work on the neck, where she could not move her neck. Her neck was in total spasm, had been since birth. And we went through a thought pattern where she started crying out with grief. I can't turn my head. I can't turn my head. And I can't turn, with panic, with grief, with fear, and all this sort of thing. And when she was able to release that, she still had a residual amount of curvature in the neck that we hadn't completed yet, but we knew we got probably 75% of it out, and she could turn her neck from one side to the other for the first time in 20-some years. And it was a beautiful thing to see, because the thought pattern was, I can't turn my neck. Now, if a person believes that they can't turn their neck, then what are they going to do? If they believe, I can't move, then their outer manifestation will be there, they can't move. And when they release that thought pattern, I can't move, and transmute it with love, with no longer resistance, then they can move. And we've had this with many cases of paralysis. We've had that happen. I can't move, or I can't turn my head. And I just wonder how many thought patterns like that are tied into the MS, in addition to physical indicators such as mercury poisoning and so on, or electric shock that has paralyzed the body. So these are things that we need to think about. I'd like now to talk about how a healing crisis progresses. Now, here's how it starts. We have to go back to the beginning. A person has a sniffly nose, a runny nose, a cold as they call it. Now remember, a cold is nothing more than a cleansing of the mucus out of the body. If a person has an improper diet which brings about a lot of mucus in the body, then the body has to get rid of the mucus and the person is going to have a runny nose. This is a cold. But what do people do when they have a cold? They suppress the cold with ascorbic acid. Or they suppress the cold with a drug, an antibiotic. And then that cold then later comes out as the next level, which will be the flu. And this is the body trying to cleanse itself once again. And so what do people do when they get the flu? They take an antibiotic, they take a lot of ascorbic acid or something else which suppresses the symptoms, and down we go to the next scale, and we get to bronchitis. And the person has all kinds of bronchial disorders, and they get bronchitis, and they cough and sput around for a while. And at this time, you suppress the bronchitis. And the bronchitis is suppressed even further into the body. And the person then gets pneumonia. And then the pneumonia is suppressed by the use of drugs. And then it goes down into asthmatic conditions. And then the asthma is suppressed. And then it gets down into emphysema, and so on. And then finally the person dies after suppressing the emphysema with all kinds of medication. Now what to a person who has emphysema? They start on the program. Now remember what I mentioned earlier. When you correct the electronic structure of the body, the physical body will heal. But it will heal in reverse order. So a person has emphysema. Now, if it's genetic, we still are dealing with the same energies. Now, the emphysema then progresses upward to the asthmatic condition. The asthmatic condition progresses upward to the pneumonia condition. The pneumonia condition goes up to the bronchitis. The bronchitis goes to the flu, and the flu eventually comes up to the cold. And then the person will continue to heal and cleanse until the cold is completely gone, and the lungs are in perfect condition, which can be seen definitely from the iris and sclera of the eye. Now I want to talk about the healing crisis relative to muscle testing. Put a 10-foot long tape measure up on the wall. And let's say that every single even number, like 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10, are your relative levels of balance. And let's say that every odd number, 3, 5, 7, 9, and so on, will be where we have a peak of healing crisis. And let's say a person starts at level 2. Now, as a person moves out of balance, upscale toward level 3, which is the peak of a healing crisis, then anything which would move the person downscale back to 2 is going to muscle test exceedingly strong. So anything which will lower the vibrational rate of the individual, like a Twinkie bar or white sugar or synthetic drugs or synthetic ascorbic acid, will muscle test very strong on the person because it's taking him down from 3 level back down into balance at 2. Now anything that's good for the person, wheatgrass juice, naturals vitamin C, alfalfa sprouts, and a good ripe apple, which would normally take a person upscale in vibratory rate, if you test a person while they're between 2 and 3 on the scale, each of those things that are of a higher vibratory rate, which will bring a person upscale, will bring them upscale away from 2 even further, and therefore anything that takes a person away from balance will muscle test weak. Now that's interesting. Until a person peaks out at 3 and then starts moving upscale by all the fresh and raw diet they're on, they start moving up to 4, and then the reverse is true, because now they're closer to 4 than they are to 2. And everything that's good for the person will muscle test strong because it's moving up to a new level of balance. And then everything like sugar and so on that muscle test weak will be taking a person back downscale out of balance, and therefore it'll muscle test weak. Now, in dealing with this, everything that a person normally has been taught with kinesiology, where there's one level of balance to the body, when a person goes into a healing crisis, they're going out of balance into a healing crisis and up toward a new level of balance, all of the traditional muscle testing techniques will reverse themselves. And everything that is good for the person will muscle test weak, and everything that is bad will muscle test strong. And until they get through the peak of the healing crisis and you're moving upscale again toward a new level of balance, then everything good will muscle test strong and everything bad will muscle test weak. This concept of kinesiology, which I discovered, must be acknowledged and understood so that when you're dealing with muscle testing, you know exactly what you're dealing with in the healing crisis. Now, there will be a tape on muscle testing which you'll need to get, which will be provided for you through Health Watchers cassettes. Now, I want to thank you for listening to Scratching the Surface a wee bit on the healing crisis and how the body regenerates as a person recreates the thought patterns, word patterns, and emotional patterns and transmutes them with love and experiences them all on the conscious level. This is enough for now. Good hunting and good holding on point holding, and may you be blessed with every blessing of life as you try your very level best to get into a better state of health both physically and mentally. Thank you. This is Dr. John Ray.